Useless Monster by Mutecos, Chapter 23, or Chapter 22. He woke with his muscles tensed and his jaw hurting. When he rolled to look at the clock, it had barely even been an hour. He let out a soft breath at that and rolled back to look out the window. He tried to not let his mind wander in circles, but the inevitability went without saying. The worries about tonight ran laps around his stomach and added twisting to follow. He almost wished he had someone to talk to about anything, or even just nothing. Anything to get his mind to shut up. It was part of why he mumbled so much. He knew he did. He has had a number of employers point out how much he did it, even if it was just talking himself through things. He tried to unclench his jaw whenever he noticed the tension, but as each bell hit, he found himself rocking his jaw side to side to try and relax the ache. By the time he got to what he believed was the bell before lunch, he didn't check since he didn't want to roll over and possibly find people gone yet. He sat up and carefully pulled off his shoes. Aizawa's aches were still dulled by sleep, so he silently slid off the cot and carried both his shoes and backpack across the room to the door. He wasn't sneaking out because he was afraid. It was to be polite and not wake up the hero who had been so badly injured a few days ago. That's what he told himself, at least, as he opened the door in as close of a manner to how he had heard Recovery Girl do so a short while ago. When faced with the opportunity to actually talk, like he had wanted to, he found himself desperately wanting to put it off for as long as he could. And so he watched Aizawa out of the corner of his eye and carefully stepped through the door and hurried out of the room. It was only after he was in the next hall that he stopped to put his shoes back on. He would have to go to the cafeteria just so that he could return with the rest of the class for next period. There wasn't anything in particular Izuku had been expecting to see when he had gotten there, but he still pulled up short when he got to the entrance. One of the adjacent tables had been pushed to rest flush against the usual table he was at. That and there was a spot, his spot, empty and waiting with a tray sat before it. There was an assortment of many different bits of food waiting on and next to the tray. The tables had a chunk of the class all sitting and talking to each other. Their voices were all already familiar enough to him that he could pick them out over the rest of the cafeteria noise. It was all just talk. Some even friendly bickering and laughter. It hurt for some reason. Why? It didn't make sense for the sight to cause him pain. The way his spot sat empty and waiting, the fact that it was even recognized as his spot in the first place. It hurt. Tsuyu looked up and caught his eye first.
Midoriya!
She lifted a hand in greeting, not quite a wave, but it was enough of an acknowledgement that the rest of the table turned to also see where she was waving. He was practically swept into his seat by the people closest to him. The flurry of questions and concerns that bombarded him as he sat had him stumped on where to even start. The part that really hit first was that they're here for me? It felt like a blur even as he registered Kirishima pushing at Mina, a laugh loud and excited echoing out over the rest of the cafeteria. Yaomomo was sitting at the end of the table near Ida, who was immediately trying to separate the two, and watched with a small smile. Uraraka was laughing at the show of aggressively physical affections. He saw the way Shinso slung an arm across the back of the booth next to Izuku, effectively reaching over his shoulders and almost touching Tsuyu on his other side. They care about me? Not just in the superficial way? He had too many teachers who would only put up a front of actual care, a sad facsimile of the real act. He looked down the table and saw the table next to them had even more of his class calmly eating. Then he noticed the foods they all had. They gave me their food. They didn't even know if I would be here, but they still did it. His eyes started to burn and he blinked a few times before he brought a hand up and wiped away a few tears. They're here for me.
Whoa, was it too much? Too noisy? What's up, Midoriya?
Kirishima sat up quickly from where he was trying to wrestle his water from Mina.
No, just... Thank you, guys. I don't think I can really find words to explain just how much this means to me.
He picked up the pair of chopsticks sitting next to the tray wrapped in a napkin that even had a little bow folded into it. You could practically feel how pleased that made everyone to hear as the barely there manic tension vanished in a breath. When Izuku saw Suyu out of the corner of his eye, he could see the concerned but questioning look and tried his best to subtly wave it off. Even as Ida once again tripped into a small lecture about how he needed to take care of himself to do the best at improving, he couldn't complain. His attempted reassurance that he knew his limits had nearly everyone giving a stern response about how knowing your limits is not the same as respecting them. It also didn't mean he couldn't accept help from friends. Friends. There was far too much for him to eat in one sitting, honestly, and he wasn't sure how to approach it. Even as Rebecca immediately spun off into a wild tale about some story she had found online, animated and lively in a way that had nearly everyone paying direct attention, he found himself stuck on that wording they had picked out. There was the easily more common way of just saying, accept help from others, but they had all specifically decided to call him a friend. They did so without hesitation or concern for how that may make them look to others, as it had for so many in his past. He gets through a third of what was all given to him, if he was generous in his guess at least, before he found himself sinking into his seat. Shinso gave off a surprising amount of warmth, and Suyu had a near-nullifying presence that made him feel rather sedated. He had no idea how to approach her about his tutelary appearance at USJ. He didn't want to have to address it at all, but he knew he would have to eventually. Izuku settled softly into the presence of his friends and dozed easily in the comfort of their boisterousness. Their energy was a bubble that kept him in such a relaxed snooze that he had to be gently shaken to get up when the bell for the end of lunch had rang. The respite was the last bit of real calm he felt for the rest of the school day proper. He found the jitters that had woken him in Recovery Girl's office hitting him in waves that left him feeling a repeated state of mental whiplash. A cycle of numbed dozing and jolting to full consciousness from an unnamed panic that made him wish he was anywhere but in the classroom. It was something typical after especially long shifts, but the fact didn't make it any easier to deal with. He hated the fact that he could even call it usual just because he knew it wasn't something that should be thought of as such. The final bell rang, and he realized he was going to have to explain why he snuck out past Aizawa. Guilt was already settling into his stomach, even as he was saying bye to his classmates and headed towards the staff room. He had promised to be there, though, and he didn't want to make any more of a liar out of himself than he already had over the course of his, existence. He was still trying to figure out some sorry reason that wasn't just telling Aizawa flat out that he was afraid when he got to the door. It slid open way easier than it should have, and he flinched preemptively at the loud thunk it would have made if not for the fact that another hand had been holding it to prevent that from happening.
You snuck out during lunch.
Aizawa's tone wasn't accusatory, just tired. Normal. Izuku tried to get something out, anything really, in the way of explaining, since he had nothing thought up yet, but before he could get a word in, Aizawa was already waving him off.
Come on. I want you to see the way home while it's still well lit out. It's the best way to learn a street, as I am sure you know very intimately.
He walked past him with his own things in tow. Izuku followed at a slight distance, unsure of how close he was supposed to be following at. He didn't say anything as he noticed they were not taking the front entrance. It was very possible that a different exit was faster.
I figured you wouldn't want your classmates seeing you leave campus with me and make some wild presumptions about whatever they decide to come up with. I want you to have a home to be settled into before you get pestered about the implications of being housed by a staff member.
Oh! He turned and looked at the school walls as they walked through the gate. It did make sense to use the exit that wasn't near the train station for that. They aren't near any homes when Aizawa slows up a bit and turns to look at him, though.
Do you have everything with you, or do you have a drop spot you keep some of your things at?
It's an incredibly fair question to be asked, but it only served to make him even more aware of how little he had. He looked at the bag Aizawa had with him, presumably holding papers from school and his sleeping bag among other things. It was definitely more packed than Izuku's, even still. He did his best not to feel self-conscious, even as he shook his head no. Aizawa accepted the answer without hesitation and continued to lead the way to his home. To any other's average walk home, it probably would have seemed unfairly long, especially when the weather was added into the mix, but Izuku had been living the epitome of the backpacker lifestyle for years now. The sight of the duplex Aizawa was steadily approaching made his stomach turn. He had no idea how in the world he was supposed to hide his shifts from a neighbor. He closed his eyes and was already writing out in his head how in the world to turn this all down and continue to be on the run, another wrench in the broken spokes of his wheel of life. For a moment, at least. He opened his eyes as he heard the familiar voice of President Mike ring out excitedly as he greeted them from the other half of the duplex. He was leaning over the railing of the second balcony as he did so, which seemed to have some clear lining covering the inside of the bars all the way around the edge until it hit the wall, and a small encased bridge connected it over to Aizawa's balcony wrapped in the same manner. Aizawa made a noise that could only be described as fond, but ignored the other readily as he walked up to his door and unlocked it.
"I will have a key made for you this weekend,"
he said as he opened it and stepped to the side once inside.
"I don't know if your family raised you with the whole slipper etiquette routine like mine did, but I don't care to spend the money on them, so we just do socks here."
Izuku wasn't sure how to say that he didn't even know which routine he was raised with, nor did he really remember the specifics of either anymore since he never actually visited any homes. Instead, he watched how Aizawa went about entering the home and mimicked it as closely as he could. As they entered, the main thing Izuku noticed was how incredibly sparse the home was. Aizawa led him past the stairs, up the entryway, and into the living room, setting his bag on a long chobode that sat between a small couch and modest TV. It gave the distinct look that it was barely lived in, and yet it still felt oddly homey. Mostly barren walls, dotted with things hung up or pinned up in a way that at first seemed haphazard, then settled as spontaneous. Marks of friends who bowled in just as fast as they left. There were scuffs at maybe 1/3 of a meter up the walls on every corner you could immediately see, presumably on the other corners as well. It was comforting to see that there wouldn't be any sort of expectation on how he impacted the home overall. No expected decorative abilities, at least. He stood there for a moment, unsure of how to conduct himself in the room, until Aizawa continued past the table and walked up to a door that led off to the side of the living room. He watched as he opened the door and stood aside, looking at him expectantly. He unclenched his jaw, trying not to come off as nervous as he felt. It was a simple bedroom. A twin bed, closet, and a desk with a stack of school supplies along with a thin box on it. Izuku walked up to it first and saw the box held a basic laptop. There were maybe 6 different notebooks, a range of pencils and pens, and even a small sketchbook. He knew he hadn't breathed since he entered the room, and he let out a soft breath as he turned to the bed and set his bag on it before picking up one of the notebooks. It was a better quality, but the same style as the ones he currently had. Pages crisp as he opened it carefully. Izuku wasn't quite sure how to fit even this sparsely filled room into a place that he could have feasibly deserved, let alone attained on his own anytime soon. It didn't even feel real as he stood staring at the blank notebook. He felt like he had been struck dumb as he couldn't drag his attention from something as simple as a stack of clean and blank notebooks.
"We didn't want to fill your room with stuff you may not like. You and I will be getting dragged out to shop with Yagi-sensei and Hizashi over the weekend. That way you can pick up 2 bedsheet sets, clothes, and anything else you may want for the room,"
Aizawa said from the doorway.
"Teens should have more than 2 pairs of clothes and a uniform."
He turned and looked at him, eyes watering, and couldn't even think of a way to say what this meant. He couldn't even really process it still as he gripped the notebook in his hands a little harder. An affirmation of reality. Aizawa was carefully looking at the desk instead of the bed, and that gave him at least a little privacy in his fumbling.
"I don't know if you would be one to decorate, but my home is yours now, Midoriya. Add what you would like. I want this place to feel like a safety, not a burden. I usually do my work in the living room if you would like to join me. Otherwise, feel free to set up how you want and do what you would normally,"
he said gently as he turned to leave the room. Izuku watched him go before putting the notebook back on the small stack. He slowly pulled his things out of his bag and set them out on the bed, including his valuables. There were a few hangers in the closet already, along with a small dresser. The dresser looked like it was either new or had not been used since it was purchased. He folded his few pieces of clothing and set them on top of it. He hadn't been able to wash them recently, and he didn't want to put them in drawers while dirty. He put his valuables in the back corner of the bottom drawer. Safe. Most people checked top drawers for valuables, ease of access, in case of evacuation and such. He knew his valuables were not exactly valuable to the world at large, but it still made him feel better about taking them out of his bag. All that was left in his bag at this point, he wasn't going to take his cash out, was his schoolwork. So he took out his cluttered notes and gently moved the stuff on his desk to the side and started to go over the English grammar sheet they had been assigned for the weekend. He felt, when Aizawa came by an hour later and checked on him, he was finishing a math sheet by then, and the way he lingered made Izuku look up.
Yes, Sensei?
He set the pencil down and turned to look at him fully. Was something wrong? Did I mess it up already? He knew it had barely been any time, but the worry was still there. He always did his homework as soon as he could so that he could have more time to do actual work for cash. Maybe it was weird he did it so soon? What was the normal way to approach homework?
I had Izashi go and get us some takeout.
He picked up his hand to reveal a bag of what presumably was said takeout.
If you would like to come eat.
Oh, okay.
Izuku looked at the problem he was halfway through and settled his nervous heartbeat as best as he could as he got up to follow Aizawa to wherever they were supposed to be eating. The bag was set onto the same small table in the living room that Aizawa had set his bag on when they first got there. Papers had since been scattered across half of it, and the TV was on but at a low volume, subtitles steadily scrolling across the bottom. Izuku sat at a corner that was clear of any papers and waited patiently as Aizawa pulled the small array of food out of the bag and set it out with some chopsticks and 2 small plates he had left quickly to grab. It felt almost like the plates had been an afterthought, and they likely were if the slightly considering look he gave the spread was anything to go by. It was comforting that even Aizawa was figuring this out at the same time he was. Izuku was well aware of how difficult it was to handle, and that was something Aizawa was probably on the road to understanding right now. They both quietly said a thank you for the meal, and eat for a bit before Aizawa broke the silence.
Did you intend to spend all night out last night?
Izuku felt a little ridiculous over the fact that the unexpected talking actually made him jump, even though Aizawa just continued to eat. There were no further questions. There was no pressure put onto the original one either, and Izuku watched as Aizawa took a pen to a paper next to him, striking out a line or so. He wanted to test if this was a required answer, and took a moment to hesitantly take a few more bites, but Aizawa still didn't push any further. It was weird to him. This gentle patience was something that he had only previously really experienced with Yagi, and even then there had initially been a period of time in which there was clear desire to learn the truth in the air behind it all. He looked down at the table in front of him, the food spread on it, the stuff being gifted to him, without any obvious expectations behind it, and set his chopsticks down. The click they made had him cringing back internally. He could feel the moment Aizawa's eyes shifted to focus on him. He had not really explained the specifics before. Not to someone else, at least.
I have a time frame.
He knows it doesn't really answer anything, but he was going to work it out. He just needed a moment to figure out how to word it. And Aizawa was still waiting patiently. It felt undeserved to him, but he didn't want to try to instigate any more stress than he was already feeling.
I was hoping it wasn't going to be last night, but
He sighed.
It's a loose time frame. I've kind of told Yagi-san a bit about it, but I didn't tell him about how consistent it can be. It didn't matter. Every 7 to 10 days, I don't get to pick when or how long so much as it just happens, but I end up shifting into... Yeah, I was hoping it was going to be the night before last. I was hoping for a day to recover first, but that obviously didn't turn out. So I spent the night taking a run. That's all. All I know for sure is that it's every week or so, at between sunset and sunrise. Yes, it will still happen if I'm asleep, but I don't... I won't let anyone find me like that, so I stay up for it. This last one was just unusually long.
You have been under an incredible amount of stress this past week, Midoriya.
Aizawa's tone was odd as he said it, almost like he was both trying to support but scold him in the same breath.
I'm not sure I follow. Every week is stressful.
You don't get stuck in a villain attack every week, though.
There is a moment of silence wherein Izuku didn't exactly look at Aizawa, and he felt the weight of Aizawa's attention got heavier for a bit before lightening again.
You won't be having to deal with that possibility anymore.
It doesn't hurt me.
Forgive me for not really trusting your judgment on the amount of damage that living in the streets alone, getting caught up in street fights, and having bare minimum food intake has done to you, kiddo.
I made it, didn't I?
Izuku didn't know what was making him feel so defensive about it. It felt personal on a level he didn't really have words to accurately describe. It felt like a judgment on his competence and resilience. He made it this far just fine. He was alive, he was still in school, and has had plenty of work experience. He was smart about how he has lived this far, and that was something he was going to defend on his own. He pushed the vitriol down hard, jaw tensing and untensing as he took steady breaths.
You did. I just don't think any child should have to go through that alone. Hurt isn't just physical, and we will be working with you to get you to even better ground than you are currently on. You did well. Now it is our turn as adults to give what should have been provided much sooner by the adults you have known in the past.
Izuku only can meet his eyes for a moment before looking back down at the chopsticks in front of him.
Have you ever missed one of these shifts?
No, I just hide when it happens the best I can so that I don't get taken away by anyone. And it's otherwise exactly the same as when I usually change. No loss of control or blacking out or anything. It only hurts to shift if I try to keep it from happening. The only real physical difference is that it makes me really restless and hungry afterwards. I also get really tired afterwards, but the restlessness keeps me up.
You think that's because of you taking these times to stay on the move, or is it something else?
How should I know? I haven't had anywhere to stay for years.
Aizawa hums his assent. Izuku knew it was a strong argument to the implications of what was unsaid.
Something to be seen, then.
I guess this is the beginning of you wanting to ask your questions, though? Like I've said before, I know you have tried to follow me for years.
He rolled up the edge of his sock and unrolled it absently. He just needed something to do with his hands. In his head, he settled to just answer like he was talking to Yagi. Yagi was safe and seemed to be confident in trusting Aizawa to house him. Just pretend you are talking to Yagi-san. It'll be okay.
I can understand you dodging me. Locating chronic eye strain is probably easy for your quirk. But what about every other hero patrol, or the police, or even just other people?
I never said I haven't almost been caught. I know full well that I've been seen and chased and almost caught. I've tried helping people directly when I was younger, but it often just ended up with me getting even more hurt or trapped by the end of it. The only thing in my favor is that everyone who thinks about trying to find the local monster or beast doesn't think that it might be a 2-in-1 package. I can walk just fine by you or anyone else as a human. I've done it to you directly a few times. If you looked at me and didn't know I wasn't a big scary monster, you wouldn't blink twice at me on my own. Quirks usually have tells. There's a little something that gives away metamorphic quirks. If someone thought that the freakish thing on the roof the other night was some wild quirk, they would try to look for something that gives it away. People are not as perceptive as we like to think we are. It's easy to slip into a crowd.
And your old teachers? What about parent-teacher meetings?
I didn't exactly go to the richest school. When I said that my mother was busy working multiple jobs enough times, the teachers just stopped bothering. Anyone could fake paperwork easily enough. If anything, the biggest problem I ever had about keeping what little life I had stable was keeping Bakugo's mom from getting to look too deep into things and to get her from trying to find out why her best friend decided to up and ghost her.
Bakugo and you grew up together more than just in a school setting, then.
We were close enough that he still calls my mother his aunt. The secret wasn't as hard as I had originally been thinking it would be over the years, though. Bakugo has wanted nothing to do with me for years, so I could lean into that fact for the tiny amount of information I would indirectly feed about her. It was always small things. The phone got broken and she was going to get a new one soon. We moved and I didn't know the address yet. Work was very busy, but we would visit soon. Just anything that wasn't that she was missing. People didn't ding because I still had money for lunches and supplies and my grades weren't bad. No reason to do what they didn't really care to do in the first place.
And in the winter, or during storms, what would you do? You could have stayed at a cafe, I imagine, but I know those can get expensive.
There are a lot more unsecured construction sites than you would think to use for storms. Most heating units are on the tops of buildings in a number of the neighborhoods and easy to duck around to keep the chill out. Summer can get hot, but the ocean is right there, and no one really asks why there is a kid that looks to be playing in the water. And even then, that was only when I couldn't find a job for the hot part of the day that had some AC involved. I only really had a problem with one of the bigger recent monsoons, but I stayed in a library for that and stayed hidden until they closed. I just slept it off wherever I was hidden so that I wouldn't trip any of the security systems. It sounds bad, but it is a lot easier to break into places than people like to think. I had my things I figured out, and if I was looking for help on how to do something, the internet is easy to access at libraries and school. I just was careful with what I looked into, is all.
Izuku trailed off after that, and the TV filled the silence distantly. He heard the hesitant breath Aizawa took before he asked his last question.
And you truly do not know anything about where Midoriya Inko may have disappeared to.
Izuku looked at him briefly before he picked his chopsticks back up.
No.
Aizawa could see the moment the shutdown happened. It was a question he had to ask, though. It wasn't to imply he thought Midoriya was keeping secrets about her whereabouts. It was just trying to glean literally any clues he could. Midoriya clearly did not accept that his mother was likely dead long ago. It wasn't healthy for him.
Okay.
He let it go. Midoriya stayed still for a moment before quietly eating only a small amount more. The food was quickly abandoned, though, in favor of moving to the couch and watching the news scroll behind him. Aizawa didn't bother turning around to see it, instead going about putting away the leftover food, after which he settled into grading some of the classwork he already had set out. It was a few hours later, when he was putting away his curriculum adjustments, that he heard a soft and steady breathing from the couch. He looked up to see Midoriya asleep, curled in a sitting position with his cheek against his knees and his arms loosely wrapped around his legs to hold them in place. He was so neatly tucked into the position that Aizawa could only imagine how many times he'd slept exactly like this in his life. He sighed as quietly as he could as he got up and gathered one of his spare blankets he had bought last minute in case Midoriya had wanted more than the bare minimum bedding he had bought for this first night. He set out his futon and left the TV on so that in the event of Midoriya waking up, he could easily maneuver his new surroundings without worry. Once he had finished setting everything out, he shook out the blanket and carefully draped it over the slope of Midoriya's shoulders and laid on his futon to follow him into sleep.